the TAG International Business Society, and I want to welcome you to a great panel discussion on privacy and issues in compliance with it. And I hope you enjoy it, and we'll come to our other events. Our next event will be October 6th at 5:30 in the evening on the rooftop of the Coda building. It'll be our annual Where Georgia Leads event. It should be a great event for anybody who wants to come network with other people and learn about where Georgia leads and what else is available for people out there who want to expand. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, our moderator, and take it away.
Well, great. Thanks, Mark. And I'm excited about today. I can tell you this is going to be fun for me because I am absolutely in no way a data or privacy expert. So I'm very happy to have the three panelists that we do today with Bess Hinson, Jody Daniels, and Sally Wright, who come from various different backgrounds, from attorney to CEO and CIO. But I'm excited to just kind of sit back and listen to y'all's brilliance. Hopefully, ask a couple of questions to get things going, because I do think this is a really timely topic, given all the data breaches that have been going on, all the changes in technology that we've seen over the past few years, and now more than ever, privacy is incredibly important, and it's a hot topic. So I will remind everyone. This is supposed to be interactive, so please feel free to drop any follow-up questions or anything in the chat, and I'll try to make sure that the panelists see those, and I'm happy to ask those throughout or at the very end as well. So feel free to drop any questions that you have that come up. I'm going to kind of change my first question for y'all, which I think, given we were just talking about travel and travel potentially being shut down, going to some other countries and everything else. I mean, I'm curious from your perspectives of how Corona's really kind of affected the data privacy world for businesses. I mean, we know e-commerce has increased by 40% year over year. The way people buy is forever changed, and I'm just wondering, any significant changes to businesses on like who needs to be protected, how it's being protected, anything that you've seen that's fundamentally changed here because of the impact of the pandemic. And I'll throw that out to any one of the three of y'all if someone wants to take that first. Jody, Bess.
Sure, I can start. In my view, there's a couple different places it's impacted. The first is you have a number of companies who went through some type of digital transformation, from the local restaurant who didn't have a menu online to now you can order it locally and collecting all kinds of information, to larger companies that really needed to move everyone to cloud systems and have gone through some type of digital transformation. As a result, all those companies now have more data that they didn't have before. And there's a whole series of activities around the volume of data that they now need to deal with from a privacy and security point of view. And then the other significant risk is just what remote work and remote access did. All of those companies are now significantly vulnerable. You've had companies who weren't prepared to throw thousands of people out into a remote universe. Did they have the right security measures, VPN in place? People are using personal laptops. Data is really more vulnerable and easier to access by threat actors.
So it's really interesting. I mean, there's a couple things there. I mean, especially with like the massive increase in data that you probably weren't expecting to have, to your point, for some of these smaller companies. When it comes to like setting up, your privacy and your data structure, I mean, I would assume you want to start in the beginning, right? Rather than actually like trying to retrofit afterwards. But is there advice that you would give to a company that finds themselves in a position where all of a sudden now, yeah, we have been collecting this copious amounts of data. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to protect it. Where do they even begin?
I think the first step is know what they're doing. Where are they putting it? Literally document. I'm using these systems and these people have access, and set up all the privacy and security settings that the tools offer. And don't always go with the minimum default, but actually look at what the different settings are and determine who truly needs access to all of them. And then engage a security professional who can help, whether that's someone internal or external, but to make sure that it's set up right would be my initial advice.
So I would say, to add to what Jody had, that you would probably want to approach it by having a privacy strategy. Every company should have a privacy strategy. I mean, we have security strategies, and in my past, I functioned as a chief information security officer for major universities in the United States, where you had to really lay out what you needed and where you needed it. And we also did data classification and data management strategies. But when you're thinking about privacy, it's more than just data management, because so many things are being collected that weren't being collected before, whether they're through systems that were necessary for because of COVID, or if they are just the consumer products that are impacting us today with privacy issues. I would also tell you that privacy impacted me recently when I was going on a business trip and we were supposed to visit the client's office. And as the days traveled further, faster, the office we were going to, which is a Fortune 49, kept calling me and saying, okay, you guys can come, but we have to have your names and all this information. Then they called back the next day and they were like, you can come, but only if you're vaccinated. So vaccinations is what HIPAA provided, kind of issues around that. So, and then to find out that half of the team's not vaccinated because they're on the anti-vax side, then you're dealing with privacy of things you really didn't want to know. So.
Bess, anything you'd add to either of those 2 points, or anything else that you've seen change from your perspective throughout this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? Because at the beginning of the pandemic, we were thinking about actually tracking where our movements, right, throughout society, when we went into a restaurant, whether or not we came in contact with someone else who later on tested positive, and thinking we would have this very sophisticated testing apparatus and tracking system, right? And I remember working very briefly with some of those parties who were coming together to try and build apps, right, to track our status and whether or not we had tested positive or negative for COVID. And, you know, that is, it's not even a fast forward, it's a leap into a new decade, I think, when it comes to tracking our movements, tracking our health status in ways that we really did not foresee until the pandemic occurred, and ways that, frankly, I think are scary, right? Because that data would be held by multiple parties, whether it's the cloud hosting service provider, the government agency that's tracking that data. If we were to then make that data accessible to large real estate landlords, right, who are trying to track the people who come and go from their tenants and retail establishments, and whether or not people who enter those stores are positive or negative, or tested positive or negative. And so the sharing of that information and what was thought about, and frankly, some of the practices that were in fact implemented are frightening if we think about privacy as something we want to maintain and protect, right? Because how are you as an individual with that app on your phone who shared your positive or negative status to know how that information will be shared amongst various third parties? Of course, there would be a privacy notice, but it's something to think about. So, that was certainly one effect from the pandemic. And then also, I think now what a lot of businesses are grappling with, and my clients are grappling with, is the collection of evidence that you were in fact vaccinated, right? And retaining copies of vaccination cards, and for how long do we retain that evidence? And some countries saying, well, you need a passport, essentially. You need to show us your vaccination card in order to travel here. So So that brings up interesting questions. If you think about meetings like this or annual conferences that you like to frequent, do we want to show our vaccination status, have the conference organizer to maintain that on record so we don't have to show it again, right? Set aside the question of whether or not we need annual boosters. But is that information we want to authorize other organizations to maintain about us over the long term, just so we can come and socialize or visit in person, right? To Sally's point, the ability to go into a physical office building of a client or of a business we work with. Do we want them to maintain that information about us? And what are we giving up by consenting to that? I think it's also a separate question whether or not we can actually give consent in these situations, because at this point, it seems to be a prerequisite to work in some cases, to conduct business, to move freely into the spaces we would like to visit, whether that's a store or a country we're traveling to. So I think there has been a fundamental shift in how we think about privacy and what we're willing to give up as a consequence of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And when we were talking about traveling earlier and everything, that's something I'm willing to give up because I want to go to Iceland in 4 weeks. But I absolutely see how that all the knock-on effects from there. I kind of want to go back a little bit. Sally, you were talking about having a privacy plan, and Jody, when you're talking about some of the smaller companies and things, like all of a sudden kind of collecting a bunch of this data that they weren't maybe expecting. From a small to mid-sized company, right, that is probably not building their own proprietary databases that they're holding this, right? They're using some sort of third-party system, a point of sale or whatever else that's collecting the data. When you talk about having a privacy plan, like, is it safe to assume that that kind of third-party tech, most of it is within proper standing? It's what it needs to be. Is the responsibility on them, or is it on me if there was any sort of breach? What's your kind of take on that from someone that's kind of getting started and obviously doesn't have databases built?
So there's a lot of commercial and regulatory compliance considerations around privacy where they kind of hint about how you keep the data separate. If you're HIPAA compliant, you have to have a security officer, you have to have a privacy officer. So in the healthcare arena, they're already kind of addressing it. Are they doing a good job? Who knows? And then from the PCI compliance, which is commercial compliance, so that you are authorized to use credit cards in your business, those you have to go back and redact data. Even in the paper files, you're required to do that. In businesses today, it's very necessary for the small and medium businesses to start out with a data architecture that really considers the privacy options, and the data that is sensitive data or personally identifiable data, that it's only stored one place. There's a city in Europe, or a country in Europe called, I believe it's Estonia, that was a brand new country. And when they built their systems, they did everything from a security and privacy consideration. So the data about you, you own your data. You as the citizen owns your data. You decide if your data is authorized by you to be given to someone else. And the sensitive information is just in one database. It's not in every system, because we have a tendency, or we have had a tendency in the United States, we add a new application, we duplicate demographic data, right? Mm-hmm. And we add another new system. So your personal information could be across millions of databases across the United States today. I think the scary part is when data aggregation starts to happen, and the data aggregation gives you the ability to see things about people that should be private. For example, in higher education research, if we were sharing data from one researcher to the next, we would de-identify the data. But then you needed to be able to re-identify the data in case you came up with these wonderful opportunities to prevent cancer, you'd want to be able to tell the people what they needed to do. So there's all these complexities around technologies that really need to be considered as part of a privacy and security plan. It goes hand in hand. Did I answer your question okay?
You did.
Okay.
So to that complexity that's kind of ever building, if you're starting a company, and this is kind of open to any of y'all that would like to answer, I mean, when do you put someone in charge of that? A chief privacy officer, or do you outsource it? Do you go to a consultant to a certain degree until you bring it inside? What's your recommendation from there?
Well, as someone who does that, I'm happy to share a little bit of my point of view. And I think it differs for every company. I would say that you want to be thinking about privacy at the very beginning. Typically, a brand new company starting does not need a full-time privacy officer unless they're in the healthcare space where one is required. If you're offering services in the EU, you might need a special data protection officer. But even at that point, it still might not be a full-time role. If the company is very data centric, and as you have more volumes of data, potentially the type of analytics that you're doing or how you're processing it, the complexity of your customers, as it starts to become more involved, almost every day you have more and more agreements that you're reviewing or more security and privacy questionnaires. That's when I think you start realizing, no different than any other area, of when do I hire somebody? So oftentimes you probably still might even need outside resources. You likely still need outside privacy counsel and outside privacy consulting and security consulting to help you make sure you're staying on top of all the trends and all the new privacy laws that are coming along, best practices in the industry. But I think the most important piece is to have someone internally kind of anointed privacy and paying attention to it. And that point person can really help make sure that you're bringing in the right people from the outside for the needs of the business. And as it grows, truly, in my view, no different than every other way of you decide I need to hire someone in a particular field, then you realize, oh, I need a full-time one of those internally. And often, even when you have someone in a spot, you still supplement with outside resources as appropriate, just like you do for any other function of a company. But I think the critical piece, just to reiterate, is so many companies think I'm too small, I don't need to do anything. And even if you look, if you're a US company, they'll think, oh, I'm just a startup, no one's going to bother me. From a security point of view, you're 60% vulnerable. That's where 60% of small businesses will suffer an attack. And from a privacy point of view, you might be technically too small for some of the laws, but your customers are not reading the laws to know the nuance and the technicalities. The expectation is just that you comply. And so I think it's really important for companies to understand that and begin putting whomever with some privacy knowledge and able to get the right resources around them.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, bringing up like those startups and the feeling of too small, because most getting going don't have a ton of extra funds sitting around, and so every dollar that you're putting into it, you're saying, where's my ROI on this, right? Like, what am I getting? Where am I getting new sales off of this? Where am I getting marketing dollars off of this? So I think it's really important trying to understand the costs afterwards. And we actually just got a question, I think, that lines up with this, of someone asking to understand, how you're kind of cost justifying or articulating the business value of these initiatives. Is it reputation? Is it compliance of? Is it the worry of a breach and what that'll cost you? Who'd like to jump in there?
I'm happy to start, but I don't want to be the only one talking.
Start.
Pastor Sally, do you want to take this one first?
So I would just tell them that today it may not be a standard cost of doing business, but if it's not today, it will be tomorrow. So you're going to just have to consider it something you have to do. The GDPR, which we will end up with a law like that soon, I hope, and Bess can talk more to that, but we have to do something about privacy because there is none today. There just is none. And I remember working for Georgia State University in the CIO capacity and talking to the former president of Georgia State. I had just come back from a conference at Disney World where you got, instead of a key to your room, you got a band to wear on your arm. And with that, they could track everywhere you were going. They could bill your meals for you. I was just collecting all this data, and I showed it to that president, and he said, "Oh, I want to get this for every student." And then I backed off and said, "I don't want you to know where my kids are all the time. I don't think that's healthy." But not him personally, but the university to know. So I just think you're going to have to expect privacy and the cost of privacy to be a cost of doing business. Back to you, Jody.
Losing deals, or the contract is coming through saying, okay, here's my privacy and security questionnaire, and I need to make sure that you are compliant with X, Y, and Z law, whichever one it is. I've seen it for HIPAA, for GDPR, for the California laws. And the company then can't answer that. They are going to lose that sale. Or if they say, oh, well, we're working on it, they may or may not get to keep it. So it's, if you have a competitor who already has all of that, to me, the justification is that sale that you've just lost. If you flip that around, how many more sales could you earn because you're putting this first? So it is a little bit hard to justify and quantify the cost right now. You could look at the data that you have, think about a data breach, how much it costs per record, try and extrapolate that out and say, well, here's the percentage likelihood you might have one of those, do this kind of work, and you'll try and prevent it. But it's important to understand that security work and privacy work they're different. They're connected, but they're different. So on one side, we can be talking about protection of a data breach. On another side, we can be talking about compliance with the law. And I think that's really important for people to understand. They're both really important these days.
Yeah, I think that's really important too from a B2B. Sorry, go ahead, Bess.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Jody. I mean, I think it's pretty simple, and I know that it's hard to convince your business leaders of the value when you have a lot of other costs to try and grow your business. But I work on a lot of data security and privacy related due diligence in an M&A context, right? And transactions, as well as investment rounds, funding that's being raised. And in that due diligence context, you have a lot of PE firms that have their own outside third-party security due diligence teams who will maybe, beknownst to you or unbeknownst to you, right, are going to start poking at your systems, your security architecture, your network. I've had deals that I've worked on where that third party has issued a report to the PE firm and has said, oh, we've found something here. And by the way, we were able to access some PHI or PII or some, IP or other sensitive information. And it's enough for us to believe that maybe someone else has gained access to it. And you know what happens when the PE firm gets that report? The deal goes on ice. It's over, right? So if you've not invested in your own pen test in the past 18 months, or in the last 6 months leading up to going through the due diligence process, and they find something that you didn't know about and you didn't fix, right? And you're maybe just trusting and for lack of a better phrase, an interested party internally, right, whose job it is to say they've taken care of it, right? It can be a really bad situation. And even let's say hypothetically you're able to assure that PE firm or that investor that no other third parties have access to that information, your purchase price is probably going to get cut. And I'm not talking about $1 million. I'm talking about $5, $10 million, right? Or the investment, because this is a big deal these days, and data breaches and regulatory penalties are incredibly expensive. The other, cost-saving piece, I'm probably speaking more to the security side than the privacy side, as Jody was indicating. There's sort of two separate considerations. Is if you are in a business that wants to have cyber liability insurance, which as a startup, I'd recommend that you have it and you find a broker that can provide it, because even a very small breach that occurs on a third-party system can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Insurance carriers are really starting to scrutinize whether or not you have policies, you've thought about security at your business. And if you haven't, they're going to increase the price of your premium significantly, right? And they'll do that every year and it'll keep going up, right? So if you're not investing the money now or as soon as you're able to, right, you're having to spend more money over time for certain protections that are, frankly, in the B2B context, your customers are going to ask you whether, if you're a service provider, for example, ask you whether or not you have cyber liability insurance at a certain level or a certain amount, right? That's a frequent contractual requirement that I see. And you can only fake it for so long, right? I mean, it's true, because you're going to get a couple customers and then you're going to see the big fish that's going to be within your reach. And the big fish is not going to be fooled because they have a team of 50 people who scrutinize this every day, right? Or 100 people. And you're going to need to get ready for that big customer that you're trying to go after. And I've worked with some clients who got that big customer and the big customer said, no, you're not GDPR compliant. We're not going to go live with you until this date. And therefore you have 18 months to come into compliance with GDPR, right? And then they're pouring in a lot of money to become compliant. And I know they have that big contract waiting, but I think that tends to be the exception as opposed to the rule. I think you really need to be ready from the get-go, like Jody said, if you're trying to go after those customers.
It's interesting. So there's two things that I think I'd be curious to go into off of there. I want to ask you more about laws, but before we get into some of the laws, bringing up just insurance as a whole, right? Cyber insurance. One of the things that we were talking about weeks ago was about the cost increasing on insurance, right? Cyber insurance as a whole, certainly after things like the Colonial hack, right? Which interesting enough, came from I think one breached password basically is what wound up taking down the largest oil pipeline in the US. So for them to be that at risk that easily, what I mean, I'd be just kind of, I guess, more curious about where you see cost going for cyber insurance, and then like where, as a small to medium sized company, what do I need to be keeping in mind when I'm exploring, how I need to get into it?
So who are you posing the question to?
Any one of you.
So I recently participated in an event where a cybersecurity insurance broker did a presentation, and she did discuss the Colonial Pipeline. She said that they were paying $75,000 for, I want to say it was a $10 million contract. And after the hack, now their costs went up 600%. So if everybody that gets hacked has to pay 600% more, and it goes up every year, at some point, the cost of cyber insurance is going to not be, and people won't be able to afford it. So it becomes even more important to make sure that your systems are secure. Even the government has to have cyber insurance in order to qualify for some of the judicial systems that are in place. To be CJIS compliant, you have to have cyber insurance. And cyber insurance comes in $5 million lumps. So that would be what you would be buying. She also said that a lot of the companies couldn't get cyber insurance, that there were just different kinds of firms that perhaps they use decentralized IT, which makes them have a much higher risk, and that it made it harder for industries like higher education to get cyber insurance.
I'll just echo what Sally just shared. What I have heard from companies and even insurance brokers as well is it is hard for several companies to get it, and the cost continues to rise. So the need to get your house in order now and review your policy now is critical. It will only keep going up from here. And really looking at what you need to do to prepare for that insurance. Sally, you mentioned decentralized. So looking at your systems, how you have everything organized, they're going to ask for policies, the type of information that you have. So that really all goes back to knowing your data and knowing how you're using it and where you're using it and what procedures and policies you have in place now. It helps in a variety of ways, also insurance.
I have a comment question. I want to throw this out there. We're a small business. And I just wondered, I look for standards. Where's the standardization? Like we get RFPs from governments and their security requirements. It looks like they copied and pasted from different security requirements. I don't know. It is.
So there's NIST standards, which are the national standards. There's ISO standards, which are the international standards. It depends on what they're looking for. If you're going to do business internationally, you need the ISO.
We are ISO certified, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, is there a standard, something that I can go by and go, oh yes, we need these kind of data security protocols, and then for the insurance as well. I know we have a rider for one of our insurance for cybersecurity, but I know it's not a lot of money. So I'm listening to you guys talk, and it's definitely not $75,000, right? $1,000. So I'm just wondering, is it standardized somewhere, or is everybody just making up their requirements in there?
There is no standard law.
Yeah.
And until we have a standard law, then everybody is either going NIST or they're going ISO, or they're maybe they have their own framework that they have come up with.
CMMC is the new framework.
CMMC is for contractors of military.
Yeah.
I think it's expanded though. So,
but they're all based on NIST, and NIST is a set of guidelines and principles. It doesn't tells you what you should do. It doesn't tell you how to do it. And that's the problem, is that there's not a standard framework for how to make these things go. And this is where managed security service providers make all their money. They bring a process and a set of procedures that help you secure your environment, but it's not, you can't do one thing to make this go. You've got to do, security is about defense in depth, perimeter, host, privacy. There's so many things that go into this.
so the company that I work for does playbooks for all of this, but there's just a lot of places that you can get this kind of work done. And depending on what kind of company you are, the cyber insurance people may want some outsourced provider to do it rather than in-house.
Mm-hmm.
Did we answer your question?
Well, yeah.
Was it the answer you wanted though?
Right? No, I mean, it's just kind of reaffirm what we see, what we're going through, and sometimes you just want to throw your hand up like, what?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I want to look forward a little bit. So I want to toss it back over to you, Bess, regarding, we brought up GDPR a couple times, which is obviously an EU law, and there is no lack of new rules, regulations coming in and everything else. So is there anything that you see that we need to be thinking about in terms of new regulations, laws, things that are going to be affecting our companies from a Georgia standpoint, and then from a US standpoint, or anything that we should just have on our radar?
So, man, I could talk for a really long time to answer that question. I think what's important to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, I believe we're going to continue to see sort of an industry by industry approach to regulation in the US. And one example of that is in response or I guess in response to the Colonial Pipeline attack, right now we have proposed legislation in Congress very specific to critical infrastructure entities, right? And so there are, what are critical infrastructure entities? You think about energy, you think about travel, rail, sort of different sectors of our economy that if there were a severe attack on those sectors or companies that fall within those sectors, it would cause severe disruption, right, to our economy. And the way that we saw the Colonial Pipeline attack cause disruption. And so there, what's being proposed is that companies in those sectors would need to report any incident or suspected incident within 72 hours. The bill in the Senate is within 24 hours. And then it would give a particular agency sort of subpoena power to investigate. Now, I'm talking about this and you're probably asking, well, what does this mean for me and my small business? Well, if you're a contractor for a company that is in that space, right, and you hold information that is critical to that company operating their business and you have an attack, you've suddenly impacted a company in one of those sectors that's going to have to report out to a new federal agency potentially, right? And they're going to have to report out within 24 hours. So what does that mean your obligation is going to be? Do you have to let them know within 4 hours, within 6 hours, right? How do you track that? And so there's going to be a trickle down effect. I mean, we already see this, through HIPAA, right? Historically, there's a lot of transformation in that space as well in terms of telehealth and talking to your doctor over the internet and software providers that are providing those video services like over Zoom, needing to think about how do I protect the transmission of information related to an appointment with a doctor, right, over a video or telehealth platform. So, that there's going to be effects there. So I think because historically in the US, that's how we've thought about it with our laws governing financial data and health data. I would say look for that to continue. Now, I've kind of gotten off track, but something else I want to mention, at least on the domestic front, because I've worked on this proposed legislation here in Georgia, but we've not been successful in passing it, but there is a law that is now in existence in the state of Ohio, which provides a quote unquote safe harbor for companies that experience a data breach if they have developed policies, procedures, implemented security controls that reflect the standards we were just discussing. And again, they don't tell you how to do it. They just say, if you have essentially thoughtfully, prepared and reasonably looked at the type of data that you hold as a business or you're holding on behalf of other companies or about individuals, developed security controls, policy and procedures that reflect what we find in the NIST framework or ISO or the other recognized standards, you can use that as a defense when you're sued for a data breach, right? Or if you're being investigated by a regulatory agency. And so you have state legislatures that are starting to at least provide some incentive to businesses to invest and to be able to protect themselves to a certain extent. And we've yet to see this play out, so I can't tell you how well it would protect you in the event of a data breach. But it's something that the insurance industry is already pushing. That you're already going to see if you go through a sale of your business and you have a buyer acquiring you, they're going to look at how you've protected data, right? And so there's sort of this additional push now we're seeing in the law to incentivize or to encourage businesses to invest here without mandating it by law. And in Georgia, I've worked with the Georgia Chamber to try and propose similar legislation. We've just not been successful in getting it out of committee and to a vote. And then internationally, it's going to continue to be very challenging, right? And I think the GDPR is going to continue to dominate there in terms of being that default global standard that we're having to look to, particularly as other countries are adopting legislation very similar to the GDPR.
Great. So to that end, I mean, I guess I want to put this to any of you three that would like to jump in here in terms of advice or just insight into, because we are an international group, right? And for many of the companies here, they may be Georgia based, but they are looking to work within the UK, working within all sorts of other countries. How what's your advice or things to think about as you start to consider the data flow, right, between two different countries that have very different compliance type laws? Is there any insights or advice that you would give as you begin to expand, obviously, outside of Georgia and certainly outside of the States? I'll open that up to anybody that wants to jump in there.
So when you're looking at having your data in the cloud, you need to figure out what kind of regulatory compliance issues there might be associated with where your data can be stored. If you're government, you can't store it in certain countries. So if you go with the government cloud, Azure through the United States, through Microsoft, then you're kind of protected. So that's something to think about when you're looking at cloud providers. The other thing I would tell you to really consider is making sure that your people that work for you are trained in cybersecurity, especially cyber. I would say privacy too, but I think that that's still evolving. But from a cyber perspective, ransomware happens because people answer or click on things they're not supposed to. And knowing what you should and shouldn't click on is really important, and trying not to get scammed. So having something like KnowBe4, where your people can watch videos and what to watch for, critically important. And think of it this way too, it's only going to get worse as new technologies are deployed that like deep fake, where they're faking who you are, either through, it can be through audio, where they're using your voice to order something from the financial department, or it can be, if it's video, they can do all kinds of things to make it look like it's President Obama, or it's one of us, and the only thing that's changed is the lips that are moving are different. And this new technology is going to wreak havoc on the whole world if it hasn't already. And then when you consider all the disinformation that's being thrown around and how that's impacting, I think it will be an area for both privacy and for cybersecurity in the very near future.
Jody, anything you'd add to that international flow?
She's on mute.
Thank you. I was going to say the other big area, and Bess, I'd love your thoughts on this as well, is between the EU and the US, there's a variety of restrictions. Essentially, the EU has much higher standards than the US does, and their view is you should transfer it out at our level, not at your lower level. And so they've set in place some opportunities and ways that you can do that. However, you can't just decide, oh, I'm just going to send it to whomever. And if you're using different vendors, your vendors, and you had kind of asked this before around the responsibility of almost what I would call the daisy chain of who's responsible. Whenever you're going to use a third party, they too have to comply. And essentially, if the data is going from an EU resident into this provider, this cloud tool, this third party, then it's actually them who really needs to make sure that we have what we need in place. So an evaluation needs to take place. You need to make sure you have the right contracts in place. You need to understand their mechanisms. And there's even something called a transfer impact assessment that might even be required. A lot of thought in documentation essentially needs to take place before you can just hit the send button. Bess, I don't know if you want to add anything around kind of shrems too in some of the really interesting legal complications these days.
Yeah, so I think that for small businesses in particular, or for startups who are just getting started, who might have an opportunity with 1 or 2 prospective customers in Europe, there's a lot of excitement around that. But what you don't realize, as Jody was saying, is that you can't simply accept personal data. So let's just say that you have a customer who's going to send you, all of this information about persons who reside in France, who buy the soap in their retail store. I'm just picking that up, for example, and you bring that back, they send it to you over an email, and then you store it here on your computer in Atlanta, Georgia, and you have all of these contact details and purchasing preferences of individuals who frequent their retail shop in France and buy, luxury soap. That's not legal, essentially. You can't just transfer information about French residents back to the United States. The reason for that is that France is governed by, or falls under, the jurisdiction of the European Union, the GDPR, and one of the articles in the GDPR, they're over, I think 90 or over 90, Jody can correct me, but
99.
you can't, you can't, I often get the question of like, okay, well, if we do that, then we're GDPR compliant, right? And I'm like, well, no, there are 95 other articles we need to consider. And so we've just taken care of three or four of them. But one of them says that personal information or personal data about individuals cannot be transferred to another country, a third country, that the European Union and the European Commission deems not to have adequate data protection laws, or protections that are to the same standard or consistent with the law that exists in Europe. And we here in the United States are viewed not to have adequate data protection laws because we have discovery in our legal process. We can submit requests to an adverse party and find out internal documents and information about how a business operates. That's not customary in Europe. It's part of their legal process. We're able, our government is able to gain certain information from certain telecommunications providers, right? If there's an alleged crime and we need to find out where that bad actor is, or the last phone call they made, like we see on the TV shows, the government can get that information. We can issue subpoenas. And again, that's not what is understood to be right. It's considered to be a privacy violation in Europe. And so because of that, Europe has essentially said you can't send information about European residents to the US unless you get the parties that are sharing that information back and forth to agree to protect it as if you were in Europe, or to set up certain protections, right? And so over recent years, the US government has tried to come up with various frameworks. You may have heard of Safe Harbor, the Privacy Shield framework that companies can sign up for and attest to protecting data at a certain level that they accept from Europe. But most recently, or last year, the Court of Justice of the European Union looked at our Privacy Shield framework and said, no, this isn't good enough. We're invalidating it. And instead left us with essentially a contractual agreement that two businesses can enter into. There's still, a different situation if we're collecting the data directly from individuals, so that two businesses can enter into, and then the data can be shared freely. And so that's an extra step, and that's been further complicated more recently in that the European Commission has issued a new version of that contract, which requires additional steps like the transfer impact assessment Jody just identified, as well as implementing additional policy. What would you do if you're in the US and you have European data on your server here in Atlanta, Georgia, and you were to receive a request from the US government or a subpoena to share that information, right? You're not going to be protecting that information consistent with the standards under European law. So I'm not going to, I know we only have about 5 minutes left or so I'm not going to go into that in more detail. But the point being that you can't just transfer information back and forth without thinking about it more carefully.
That's great. Thank you for all that detail. And you're right, we're kind of up against it on time, but I wanted to at least ask one more question for everybody. You know, I mean, given that we're all collecting, storing, transmitting huge amounts of data right now, if you all could leave one big piece of advice, you know, something that everyone, if you are running a Georgia company, you need to be thinking about this. Sally, I guess I'll start with you. I'll put you on the spot first, but I mean, what's that one thing that you would you'd want everyone or to leave everyone with, or to leave have people thinking about?
I think I would go back to that security training, because, you know, knowing what to look for is really incredibly important. Knowing what not to click on is incredibly important. And then I add to that, you can't fix stupid, because you can't fix stupid, but you also need to be aware and making sure your employees are aware of what's going on from a security and privacy perspective. So train them every year or every 6 months, train them.
Our IT guy, Daniel, sends us fake spam emails all the time to try to catch us. So then he sends out a report saying 95% of you passed, here's the 5% of failures, you know? And so now every time he sends an email, even if it's a legitimate one, just saying, hey, Matt, you want to come talk, no one trusts him. So he's now officially flagged, but it's a really good point. And it has saved us a few times, because we have found a couple things. So,
and that's true not in just your work stuff, but your personal stuff. You know, if you understand what to look for, then you won't get your own self in trouble as well.
Absolutely. Bess, how about you? One thing you'd want to leave everyone with?
Yeah, I think that the first instinct that a lot of people have is to collect as much data as possible and worry about it later, because there's this perception that data is gold, right? But data can also cost you money because people are wising up. So I think, you know, think carefully about your business and what your goals are. And if it's absolutely necessary to collect identifiers about individuals in order to provide services, right? How can you minimize the amount of data that you're collecting, or anonymize identifying information, meaning, you know, an IP address that relates back to Beth Henson and her computer, you know, my first and last name, my social security number. Do you actually need that information to operate your business successfully? You know, think critically about that, because the more data you collect, particularly when it's sensitive or personal information, you know, you are creating regulatory issues for yourself and legal risks and issues that are going to be scrutinized very closely by any investor or prospective buyer of your business.
That's great. It was actually one of the questions I had lined up, and we didn't get to about potentially collecting less information. I think it's such a great attorney answer too, because and I live with an attorney, so I say that with full love, because my sales brain is like, give me all the data, right, and then I'm gonna sell it. And it's a really good point about making sure, is this really necessary, and how can we be protecting ourselves? So great. Jody, I'll give you the last word here. Any last thoughts that you'd have for everyone?
Yes. So it would be tying together what Sally and Bess just said around data. And the key is you have to know your data and you have to maintain it. And you really, every time, especially a growing company continues to evolve and change, new campaigns, new products, new services, new features, new partners, you need to follow the data flow. The data flow is going to help you with every other requirement that we've been talking about. And then the other would be what I had kind of shared before, which is that recognizing that this is a requirement and it's also an opportunity. And I truly believe it's around creating trust with customers, and those customers could be B2B, and they can also be B2C. But that's really the future of where we're going. We're in this place with all these laws because companies did things they weren't supposed to do. It's like kindergarten. So all the rules are in place because someone did what they weren't supposed to. And we're here. We might as well do the right thing and promote that we're the business doing the right thing and recognize it's a business opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about ROI and everything else, there is that marketing and sales play to just being a trustworthy company, right? From a consumer standpoint. So it's a really great
don't
point.
make security be the highest paid. That's my new issue, is lots of startups are putting the security piece, or technology companies, as like the highest tier. You get great security if you buy the highest tier. No. I should get good security if I also just get the regular tier.
Got it. Outstanding. All right. Well, I think we're a little bit over time, so I apologize, everyone. But this is a lot of great input, and really appreciate it, Bess, Jody, Sally, for all of your time. And Mark, anything else we want to leave with the team? You're on mute.
I just want to thank the panel. Remind everybody to come to our event October 6th at the Coda Building, 5:30. And we're going to break out into breakout rooms. I hope some of the panelists can come and keep the discussion going. I'd love to know what the effect is going to be with California going its own way in the US. Will that force us to comply eventually with some sort of federal standard? And lots of other topics. So those who want to stay and keep chatting, please do. It's about another 30 minutes. And with that, I think we're going to be put into breakout rooms.
Great.
But Jessica's doing it. Hold on a second. Jessica? Nope.
Yep, I'm working on it. Sorry about
Alrighty,
that.
that's all. So, I don't know if anybody else is joining us. It may just be you and I. But anyway, did you find some good information there?
Yeah, it's always a good discussion to have. I'm not an expert on GDPR, but I'm somewhat familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm not at all. I'm just kind of, all I know is this thing you got to be careful of. But I know that California's got its own version. Brazil's developing its version. The UK is no longer going to comply with it, but it's talking about its own version. Australia is setting up its version.
Mhm.
So, it's going to get a more and more complex issue.
I just always had this sense that there's a lot of technology companies that are inadvertently violating it. Because the smaller ones, they may inadvertently get some European customers on their web platform, and some of them don't even seem to be attempting to comply with GDPR.